The bus pulled into downtown Chicago at 6 in the morning. The streets were still quiet, and the winter air cut through everything like a knife. A young man stepped off the bus, his breath forming small clouds in front of his face. He wore an old wool coat that was at least 2 sizes too big for him. It had belonged to his father before he passed away 3 years ago. The coat was faded at the elbows, and the buttons didn't match anymore, because his mother had replaced them over the years with whatever she could find. His jeans had been washed so many times they had turned from dark blue to something closer to gray. His boots were scuffed and worn, the kind of boots a man wears when he works with his hands for a living. He carried 2 things with him. One was a small leather bag that held everything he owned for this trip. A change of clothes. A toothbrush. $47 in cash. The other thing he carried was a violin case. It was old and beaten up. There was duct tape wrapped around one corner where the leather had started to fall apart. The handle was held on by a piece of rope because the original handle had broken off years ago. Inside that case was the most important thing in his life. He had been traveling for 14 hours straight. He couldn't afford a plane ticket. He couldn't even afford a nice bus seat. He had taken the cheapest option available, which meant transfers in 3 different cities and a seat that didn't recline. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he thought about what was waiting for him at the end of this journey. The Lakewood Symphony Orchestra was one of the most respected orchestras in the entire country. They only held open auditions once every few years, and when they did, musicians came from all over the world to try out. Getting a spot in this orchestra could change a person's life forever. It meant a steady income. It meant respect. It meant playing music at the highest level possible. For him, it meant something even more than that. It meant proving that everything his grandmother had taught him wasn't for nothing. He walked through the city streets with a piece of paper in his hand. He had printed out the directions at the library back home because he didn't have a smartphone. He followed the street names carefully, turning left, then right, then walking straight for 6 more blocks. The buildings around him got taller and fancier the closer he got to his destination. By the time he reached the audition hall, he felt like he was standing in a different world entirely. The building was made of white stone with tall columns at the entrance. It looked like something out of a movie about rich people. There was a man in a uniform standing at the door, and for a moment, the young man wondered if he would even be allowed inside. He took a deep breath and walked up the steps. The man at the door looked at him for a long moment. His eyes moved from the worn coat to the taped-up violin case to the scuffed boots. Then he looked at the young man's face. "Auditions?" the doorman asked. "Yes, sir." The doorman nodded slowly and stepped aside. Down the hall. First door on your left. Inside, the building was even more impressive. The floors were made of polished marble that reflected the light from the chandeliers above. The walls were decorated with paintings of famous musicians and composers. Everything smelled clean and expensive, like a place that had never seen a speck of dust in its entire existence. He found the registration desk and got in line behind several other people. That's when he first noticed how different he looked from everyone else. The other musicians were dressed like they were going to a fancy dinner party. The men wore suits that fit them perfectly. The kind of suits that cost more money than his family made in a month. The women wore elegant dresses and jewelry that sparkled under the lights. Everyone had nice shoes. Everyone had nice hair. Everyone had instrument cases that looked brand new, made of polished leather with gold clasps. And then there was him, standing there in his father's old coat with his grandmother's old violin. People started to notice him. He could feel their eyes on him, moving up and down, taking in every worn thread and every patch of faded fabric. He heard whispers behind him. He couldn't make out the exact words, but he didn't need to. He knew what they were saying. He had heard it his whole life. He doesn't belong here. When he reached the front of the line, the woman behind the desk looked up at him with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm here for the audition." She looked at him for a moment, then looked at her computer screen, then looked back at him. "The violin audition?" she asked, as if she needed to make sure. "Yes, ma'am. Do you have your registration confirmation?" He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. It was wrinkled and had a coffee stain on one corner from the bus ride. but all the information was still readable. She took it from him carefully, like she was afraid it might fall apart in her hands. "All right," she said slowly. "You're checked in. Please have a seat in the waiting area. We'll call your number when it's your turn." The waiting area was a large room with rows of comfortable chairs. Most of them were already filled with other musicians. He found an empty seat in the corner, away from everyone else, and sat down with his violin case on his lap. The room was filled with quiet conversation. People were talking about their backgrounds, their training, their experience. The woman sitting closest to him was telling her neighbor about her summer in Vienna, where she had studied with a world-famous instructor. The man across from her was talking about his degree from one of the best music schools in the country. Another person mentioned that they had been playing with professional orchestras since they were 16 years old. He listened to all of it and said nothing. He had no stories like that to share. He had never been to Vienna. He had never been anywhere outside of his home state until today. He didn't have a degree from a fancy school. He had learned to play the violin in his grandmother's living room, sitting on a wooden chair with a cushion that had lost most of its stuffing. His grandmother had been the one to teach him everything. She had played in her church choir for 50 years, and before that, she had learned from her own mother, who had learned from her mother before that. The violin he carried had been passed down through 4 generations of his family. It was old and worn, and far from perfect, but when he played it, he could hear all of them. All those voices from the past, all those hands that had held this same instrument, all those hearts that had poured their souls into these same strings. That was worth more to him than any fancy degree or summer in Europe. A man sat down in the chair next to him. He was young, maybe a few years older, with slicked back hair and a suit that probably cost more than everything in the young man's leather bag combined. The man glanced over at him, then glanced at his violin case. A small smile appeared on his face. It wasn't a friendly smile. "First time at one of these?" the man asked. "Yes, I can tell." The man nodded toward the violin case. "Interesting case you've got there. Family heirloom?" "Ah, something like that." The man chuckled softly and leaned back in his chair. "Well, good luck. You're going to need it." He didn't respond. He just held his violin case a little tighter and closed his eyes. In his mind, he was back in his grandmother's living room. He could smell the flowers she always kept by the window. He could hear her voice, soft and steady, guiding him through a difficult passage. "Don't you ever let nobody tell you what you can't do," she used to say. "You just play your music, and let God sort out the rest." He opened his eyes and looked around the room at all the fancy clothes and expensive instruments and confident faces. None of them knew what he carried inside him, but they were about to find out. The waiting room grew more crowded as the morning went on. More musicians arrived, each one looking more polished and prepared than the last. The young man stayed in his corner, watching quietly, listening to the conversations happening around him. He learned a lot just by listening. The woman in the red dress had been playing violin since she was 4 years old. Her parents had hired private instructors for her, the best ones money could buy. She had performed in concert halls across Europe before she even finished high school. Now she was 23 and already had experience playing with 2 professional orchestras. This audition was just another step up the ladder for her. The tall man with the gray suit had gone to one of the most famous music schools in New York City. He talked about his professors like they were old friends. He dropped names that the young man had only ever read about in library books. His violin was a rare instrument worth more than a house. He mentioned the price casually, like it was nothing special, like everyone had a violin that cost that much. The young man with the slicked back hair, the one who had spoken to him earlier, came from a family of musicians. His father was a conductor. His mother was a concert pianist. His older sister played cello for a famous orchestra in Boston. Music wasn't just a passion for him. It was the family business. Everyone in that room had a story like that. Everyone had advantages. Everyone had connections. Everyone had expensive training and fancy degrees and instruments that cost more than the young man's family had ever seen in their entire lives. And then there was him, a kid from a small town in Mississippi. A kid who had learned to play violin from his grandmother in her living room. A kid whose family couldn't afford lessons or summer programs or trips to Europe. A kid who had worked at a grocery store since he was 15 years old just to help pay the bills. A kid who had saved up for 3 years just to afford this bus ticket. He knew what everyone in that room thought when they looked at him. He could see it in their eyes. He could hear it in the way they whispered to each other. He could feel it in the air every time someone glanced in his direction and then quickly looked away. They thought he was a joke. They thought he had wandered into the wrong building. They thought he had no chance at all. Maybe they were right. Maybe this whole trip was a mistake. Maybe he should have stayed home and kept working at the grocery store and accepted that some dreams are just too big for people like him. But then he thought about his grandmother. He thought about the way she used to sit in her rocking chair by the window, playing her violin as the sun went down. He thought about the way her fingers moved across the strings, slow and graceful, like she was having a conversation with something nobody else could see. He thought about the way she would close her eyes and smile, lost in the music, completely at peace. She had taught him that music wasn't about money or degrees or fancy instruments. Music was about the soul. Music was about taking everything you felt inside and turning it into something beautiful. Music was about connecting with something bigger than yourself. "You got a gift, baby," she used to tell him. "Don't matter where you come from or what you got. That gift is yours. Nobody can take it from you." She had passed away 2 years ago. He still missed her every single day. But he carried her with him. He carried her in the violin case on his lap. He carried her in every note he played. He wasn't here for himself. He was here for her. Around noon, the auditions finally started. A coordinator came out and called the first number. The woman in the red dress stood up confidently and walked toward the audition room. She was gone for about 20 minutes. When she came back, she looked satisfied. She whispered something to her friend, and they both smiled. One by one, the musicians were called. Some came back looking happy. Others looked nervous or disappointed. A few gathered their things and left right away, not wanting to wait around for results they already knew would be bad. The young man watched all of this and waited. The man with the slicked-back hair got called around 2 in the afternoon. Before he left, he turned to the young man with that same unfriendly smile. "Still here?" he asked. "I'm impressed. Most people would have given up by now." The young man didn't respond. He just looked at him calmly and said nothing. The man shrugged. "Suit yourself. But let me give you some advice. These judges, they know quality when they see it. And they can spot someone who doesn't belong from a mile away. You might want to save yourself the embarrassment." He walked away before the young man could respond. Not that he would have responded anyway. He had learned a long time ago that some people weren't worth arguing with. Some people had already made up their minds about you before you even opened your mouth. An hour later, something unexpected happened. The coordinator came out looking slightly flustered. She scanned the waiting room and then looked down at her clipboard. "We have a schedule change," she announced. "One of our afternoon candidates has withdrawn. Is there anyone here who would be willing to go early?" Bina. Amar. Nobody moved. Going early meant less time to prepare mentally. It meant being thrown into the deep end without warning. Most musicians wanted as much time as possible to get their nerves under control. The young man raised his hand. The coordinator looked at him with surprise. She glanced at her clipboard, then back at him. "You're sure?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "All right then, follow me." He stood up, his grandmother's violin case in his hand. As he walked toward the audition room, he could feel every eye in the waiting area on his back. He heard whispers again. He heard someone laugh softly under their breath. "Well, that's going to be quick," someone muttered, loud enough for him to hear. He didn't turn around. He didn't react. He just kept walking. The hallway leading to the audition room was long and quiet. His footsteps echoed against the marble floor. The coordinator walked ahead of him, her heels clicking with each step. "You'll have a few minutes to warm up before you begin," she said without looking back. "The judges will ask for your name and the piece you'll be performing. After that, you play. Any questions?" "No, ma'am." She stopped at a large wooden door and turned to face him. For a moment, her expression softened just a little. "Good luck," she said. And for the first time all day, someone actually sounded like they meant it. He nodded and watched as she opened the door. The audition room was bigger than he expected. It was like a small concert hall, with high ceilings and walls covered in dark wood panels. There was a stage at the front, empty except for a single music stand and a chair. Facing the stage was a long table where 5 people sat. The judges, they looked up when he entered. He saw their eyes move over him, taking in the old coat, the worn boots, the taped-up violin case. He saw the same expression he had seen all day: confusion, doubt, maybe even a little pity. One of the judges, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, checked something on the papers in front of her. "You may take the stage whenever you're ready," she said. Her voice was flat, professional, completely neutral. He walked to the stage. His boots were quiet now against the wooden floor. He set his violin case down carefully and opened it. Inside was his grandmother's violin. It was old. The wood was scratched and faded. The varnish had worn away in several places. There was a small crack near the base that had been repaired years ago with wood glue and patience. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't valuable. It wasn't the kind of instrument that belonged in a place like this, but it was his, and it was hers. And it held more music inside it than any brand new violin ever could. He lifted it gently, like he was holding something precious. He tucked it under his chin and closed his eyes. For a moment, he wasn't in that audition room anymore. He was back in Mississippi. He was sitting in his grandmother's living room. He could feel the evening sun on his face. He could hear her voice. "Play like you're talking to God, baby. Make him listen." He opened his eyes and looked at the judges. "My name is not important," he said quietly. "I'll be playing Zardes by Vittorio Monti." Then he raised his bow to the strings. The room went completely still. The 5 judges sat behind their table, pens in hand, ready to write down their notes. They had seen dozens of musicians that day. They had heard dozens of performances. Most of them blended together after a while. Another talented young person. Another polished piece. Another forgettable audition. They expected this one to be even more forgettable than the rest. The young man stood on the stage with his grandmother's violin tucked under his chin. The instrument looked out of place in that grand room. The scratched wood, the faded varnish, the repaired crack near the base, everything about it screamed that it didn't belong there. But he didn't care what it looked like. He knew what it could do. He took one deep breath, then another. He let his shoulders relax. He let his mind go quiet. He thought about his grandmother. He thought about all the evenings they had spent together, just the 2 of them, making music in her little living room while the world outside went on without them. Then he drew the bow across the strings. The first note came out soft and slow. It hung in the air like a question, like someone knocking gently on a door. The judges didn't react. One of them was already writing something down. Another one checked his watch. They had made up their minds before he even started. But then the second note came, and the third, and the fourth. The music began to build. What started as a whisper grew into a conversation. The melody rose and fell like waves on the ocean, each note flowing into the next without any effort at all. His fingers moved across the strings with a smoothness that seemed impossible. His bow glided back and forth like it was dancing. One of the judges stopped writing. She looked up from her papers and stared at the stage. The piece he was playing, Zardes, was one of the most difficult violin pieces ever written. It required perfect technique. It required speed. It required precision. But more than anything, it required feeling. It required the kind of emotion that couldn't be taught in any classroom or learned from any book. And this young man had that feeling pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. The slow opening section gave way to something faster. His fingers began to fly across the fingerboard. The notes came quicker and quicker, tumbling over each other in a rush of sound that filled every corner of that huge room. It was like watching a storm roll in across the sky. You could feel it building. You could feel the energy growing. You could feel something powerful about to break loose. Another judge stopped writing. Then another. Then all of them. They weren't just listening anymore. They were watching. They were leaning forward in their seats. They were holding their breath. The young man's body moved with the music. He swayed back and forth, not for show, but because he couldn't help it. The music was inside him, and it needed to come out. Every note was a piece of his story. Every phrase was a memory. Every crescendo was a feeling he had carried with him for years. He played the pain of losing his grandmother. He played the loneliness of being different. He played the frustration of being looked down on his whole life. He played the love he felt for his family. He played the hope he carried in his heart. He played everything he had never been able to say with words, and the judges heard all of it. The woman with the silver hair, the one who had spoken to him with such a flat voice, slowly removed her glasses. She set them down on the table and just watched. Her expression had changed. The doubt was gone. The pity was gone. In its place was something else entirely. It was respect. The music reached its peak. His bow was moving so fast now it was almost a blur. The notes came in rapid bursts, each one perfectly placed, each one ringing out clear and true. His old, worn violin sang like it had never sung before. It was as if the instrument knew this was its moment. It was as if all those years of being played in small living rooms and church halls had been leading up to this. Sweat formed on his forehead. His arm was starting to burn from the effort. But he didn't slow down. He didn't miss a single note. He pushed through the exhaustion because he knew this was his only chance. He had come too far to hold anything back now. The final section of the piece was the hardest. It required the kind of speed and precision that separated good musicians from great ones. Many professional violinists struggled with it. Many avoided playing it altogether because of how easy it was to make a mistake. He didn't make a single mistake. His fingers were a blur against the strings. The bow moved so fast it seemed impossible that any human could control it. But he was in complete control. Every note landed exactly where it was supposed to. Every phrase flowed perfectly into the next. It was like watching someone perform magic right in front of your eyes. The room seemed to shrink. The high ceilings, the wooden walls, the fancy decorations, none of it mattered anymore. The only thing that existed was the music. The only thing that mattered was the sound coming from that old, beat-up violin. And then, with one final burst of energy, he played the last notes. The music climbed higher and higher, building to an impossible peak. His whole body was moving now, lost in the moment, giving everything he had to those final seconds. And then, with a flourish of his bow, it was over. The last note rang out and slowly faded into silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even breathed. The young man stood on the stage, his chest heaving, his arm aching, his heart pounding. He lowered his violin and looked at the judges. They were staring at him like they had just witnessed something they couldn't explain. The silence stretched on. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. It felt like an eternity. Then the woman with the silver hair did something that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She started to clap. It was slow at first. Just her hands coming together. Once. Twice. 3 times. But then the judge next to her joined in. And then the next one. And the next one, until all 5 of them were applauding. One of them stood up from his chair. Then another one did the same. They were giving him a standing ovation. The young man didn't know how to react. He had never experienced anything like this before. He had played at church gatherings and small community events, and his grandmother's living room. He had never played for people like this. He had never been applauded by people who had spent their whole lives surrounded by the best musicians in the world. But here they were, standing up for him, clapping for him, looking at him with something he had never seen directed at himself before: admiration. The woman with the silver hair wiped something from the corner of her eye. She tried to hide it, but he saw it. He had made her feel something. His music had reached her in a way that all the fancy degrees and expensive instruments in the world couldn't. "Thank you," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. Thank you." He nodded slowly. He didn't trust himself to speak. If he opened his mouth, he might cry. And he had promised himself he wouldn't cry, no matter what happened. He picked up his violin case, the one held together with duct tape and rope, and carefully placed his grandmother's violin back inside. He closed the lid gently, like he was tucking a child into bed. Then he walked off the stage. As he made his way back toward the door, he could still hear the judges talking behind him. He couldn't make out the words, but he could hear the tone. It wasn't the dismissive tone he had heard all day. It was something different, something he hadn't expected. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped back into the hallway. The coordinator was waiting for him. Her eyes were wide. She had heard everything through the door. "That was incredible," she whispered. He didn't say anything. He just nodded and walked past her, back toward the waiting room. He didn't know what was going to happen next. He didn't know if his performance would be enough. He didn't know if they would choose him over all those other musicians with their fancy backgrounds and expensive instruments. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he had been truly heard, and that alone was worth the 14-hour bus ride. When he walked back into the waiting room, everything felt different. The conversation stopped. The whispers went quiet. Every single person in that room turned to look at him. But this time, they weren't looking at him the way they had before. There was no mockery in their eyes. There was no pity. There was no amusement. There was confusion. And maybe even a little bit of fear. They had heard the applause. Sound traveled through those old walls, and everyone in the waiting area had heard the clapping coming from the audition room. They had heard it go on and on. They had heard the kind of applause that almost never happened at auditions like this. And now they were looking at the young man in the worn coat and scuffed boots, trying to figure out what had just happened. He didn't say anything to any of them. He just walked back to his corner seat, sat down, and placed his violin case on his lap. He kept his eyes forward. He kept his face calm. Inside, his heart was still racing. His hands were still trembling slightly from the performance. But on the outside, he showed nothing. The man with the slicked-back hair was sitting a few seats away. He was staring at the young man with an expression that was hard to read. His mouth was open slightly, like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, he spoke. "What happened in there?" The young man turned to look at him. He remembered all the things this man had said to him earlier. The jokes about his violin case, the comments about not belonging, the advice to save himself, the embarrassment. He could have been petty. He could have thrown those words back in his face. He could have made him feel small the way he had tried to make him feel small. But that wasn't who he was. That wasn't how his grandmother had raised him. "I just played my music," he said simply. "That's all." The man with the slicked-back hair didn't respond. He just nodded slowly and looked away. For the first time all day, he had nothing clever to say. The auditions continued throughout the afternoon. More musicians were called. More performances were given. But something had shifted in the room. The confidence that had filled the air earlier was gone. People were quieter now. More nervous. They had all heard what had happened, and they were all wondering the same thing. Who was this kid, and where had he come from? Around 5 o'clock, the coordinator came out and announced that the auditions were finished for the day. The results would be posted within 3 days. Everyone would receive a phone call, letting them know whether they had been selected for a callback or not. 3 days. That was how long he would have to wait. The other musicians gathered their things and started to leave. Some of them walked out in groups, talking quietly among themselves. Others left alone, their faces tight with worry. The woman in the red dress passed by him on her way out. She glanced at him for just a moment, and he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It looked almost like respect. He waited until most of the others had gone before he stood up. He didn't want to walk out with them. He didn't want to make small talk or answer questions. He just wanted to be alone with his thoughts. The coordinator caught him at the door. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I just wanted to say, I've been working these auditions for 12 years. I've heard a lot of musicians. A lot of really talented people." She paused and looked at him with serious eyes. "I've never heard anything like what you did in there today." He didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to compliments like that. "Thank you, ma'am," he managed. She smiled. "Good luck. I really hope you get it." He nodded and walked out into the cold Chicago evening. The sun was already going down. The temperature had dropped even further since that morning. He pulled his father's old coat tighter around himself and started walking. He couldn't afford a hotel. He had known that from the beginning. His plan was to spend the night at the bus station and catch the first bus home in the morning. It wasn't comfortable, but it was what he could manage. He had slept in worse places before. As he walked through the city streets, he thought about everything that had happened. The stares, the whispers, the man with the slicked-back hair and his cruel smile, the judges with their doubtful eyes. And then the music. The way it had poured out of him like something that had been locked up for years, finally breaking free. He thought about his grandmother. He wondered if she had been watching somehow. He wondered if she was proud of him. He reached the bus station around 7 o'clock. It was crowded and noisy, filled with travelers and homeless people, and everyone in between. He found an empty bench in a corner and sat down with his violin case clutched against his chest. He was exhausted. The sleepless bus ride, the long day of waiting, the intensity of the performance. It all caught up with him at once. His body ached. His eyes were heavy. But his mind wouldn't stop racing. What if it wasn't enough? What if the judges had already forgotten about him? What if they chose someone with a better background, a better degree, a better instrument? What if he went home with nothing but a good story and an empty wallet? He shook his head. He couldn't think like that. He had done everything he could. He had given everything he had. Whatever happened next was out of his hands. He pulled out his phone. It was an old flip phone, the kind that barely worked anymore. But it could still make calls. And that was all he needed. He dialed his mother's number. She picked up on the second ring. "Baby? Is that you? How did it go?" The sound of her voice made his throat tighten. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear it until that moment. "It went okay, Mama," he said quietly. "I think it went okay. Tell me everything. I've been praying for you all day. Your aunt came over and we've been sitting here waiting to hear from you." He smiled despite himself. He could picture them sitting in his mother's kitchen, probably drinking coffee and watching the phone like it might jump off the table. He told her about the fancy building, the marble floors, the chandeliers. He told her about the other musicians with their expensive clothes and their impressive backgrounds. He told her about the man who had made fun of his violin case. He told her about the judges and their doubtful faces. And then he told her about the performance. His mother was silent on the other end of the line. He could hear her breathing. He could hear his aunt saying something in the background. "They stood up, Mama," he said, his voice cracking just a little. They stood up and clapped. All of them. His mother made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Oh, baby," she whispered. "Your grandmother is smiling right now. I know she is. She's up there smiling down at you." He had to close his eyes to keep the tears from falling. "I don't know if I got it," he said. "I won't know for 3 days. But I did my best. I played like she taught me. I played with everything I had." "That's all anyone can do," his mother said. "That's all anyone can ever do. You come home now. Okay? Come home and rest. Whatever happens, we're proud of you. We've always been proud of you." He promised he would be home by the next afternoon. He told her he loved her. Then he hung up and sat there in the bus station, surrounded by strangers, holding his grandmother's violin like it was the most precious thing in the world. Because it was. He didn't sleep much that night. The bench was hard. The station was loud. But every time he closed his eyes, he heard the music. He heard the applause. He heard the coordinator's voice telling him she had never heard anything like it. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the doubt and fear and exhaustion, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. 3 days. He just had to wait 3 days. He held his violin case against his chest and watched the hours tick by until the sun came up again. The bus ride home felt even longer than the ride there. 14 hours of staring out the window, watching the cities turn into towns, and the towns turn into fields. 14 hours of replaying every moment of the audition in his head. The way the judges had looked at him when he first walked in, the way their faces had changed when he started to play, the standing ovation, the coordinator's words, but also the doubt, the fear, the voice in the back of his mind that kept asking the same question over and over again. What if it wasn't enough? He got home late in the evening. His mother was waiting for him on the front porch, wrapped in a blanket against the cold. When she saw him walking up the road, she stood up and opened her arms. He walked into her embrace and held on tight, like he was a little boy again. "I'm proud of you," she whispered into his ear. "No matter what happens, I'm so proud of you." The next 3 days were the longest of his life. He went back to work at the grocery store. He stocked shelves and helped customers, and tried to act like everything was normal. But every time his phone buzzed, his heart jumped into his throat. Every time someone called his name, he thought it might be the news he was waiting for. His coworkers noticed something was different about him. He was quieter than usual, more distracted. One of them, an older man who had worked at the store for 20 years, asked him if everything was okay. "Just waiting on something," he said. "Something important." The older man nodded like he understood. "Well, whatever it is, I hope it works out for you. You're a good kid. You deserve good things." On the third day, he was in the back room unpacking boxes when his phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was a number he didn't recognize. A Chicago area code. His hands started shaking. He almost dropped the phone. He took a deep breath and answered. "Hello? Good afternoon. Am I speaking with the young man who auditioned for the Lakewood Symphony Orchestra on Monday?" His throat went dry. "Yes, ma'am. That's me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. It felt like it lasted forever. "My name is Dr. Helen Mitchell. I'm the director of the Lakewood Symphony Orchestra. I was one of the judges at your audition." He recognized the name. She was the woman with the silver hair. The one who had started the applause. The one who had wiped something from her eye when he finished playing. "Yes, ma'am," he said again. He couldn't think of anything else to say. "I've been doing this job for over 30 years, she continued. "I've heard thousands of musicians audition for our orchestra. Some of them were good. Some of them were excellent. A few of them were truly exceptional." She paused again. "What you did on that stage was something I have never experienced before." He leaned against the wall of the back room because his legs didn't feel strong enough to hold him up anymore. "The judges deliberated for 2 days, Dr. Mitchell said. "We reviewed every audition. We discussed every candidate. And in the end, the decision was unanimous." He closed his eyes. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "We would like to offer you a position with the Lakewood Symphony Orchestra. Not just any position. We would like to offer you the role of first chair violin." For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He couldn't speak. He couldn't do anything except stand there with his phone pressed against his ear, trying to understand what he had just heard. First chair violin, the lead violinist, the most important position in the entire string section. The position that only went to the very best. "Sir, are you still there?" "Yes, ma'am," he managed to say. His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here. I should tell you," Dr. Mitchell continued. "This position has never been held by someone as young as you, and it has never been held by anyone who didn't come from a traditional conservatory background. You would be making history. Making history. Him, a kid from a small town in Mississippi, who learned to play violin in his grandmother's living room. Do you accept?" Dr. Mitchell asked. He thought about everything that had led him to this moment. The years of practice, the sacrifices his family had made, the 14-hour bus rides, the people who had laughed at him, the people who had told him he would never amount to anything, the people who had looked at his clothes and his violin case and decided he wasn't worth their time, and he thought about his grandmother. Her gentle hands guiding his fingers across the strings, her voice telling him to play like he was talking to God, her unwavering belief that he had something special inside him that the world needed to hear. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I accept." He could hear the smile in Dr. Mitchell's voice. "I'm very glad. We'll send you all the details by mail." Welcome to the Lakewood Symphony Orchestra. We're honored to have you." After he hung up, he stood in that back room for a long time. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there with tears running down his face, letting it all sink in. Then he called his mother. She answered on the first ring. She had been waiting by the phone all day. "Well?" she said. Her voice was tense with hope and fear. "I got it, Mama," he said. "I got first chair." The scream that came through the phone was so loud he had to hold it away from his ear. He could hear his aunt in the background, asking what happened. And then she started screaming too. He could hear them hugging each other, crying and laughing at the same time. "My baby," his mother kept saying through her tears. "My baby did it. Oh Lord, my baby did it." He quit his job at the grocery store that same day. His boss shook his hand and told him he always knew he was destined for something bigger. His co-workers gathered around to congratulate him. The older man who had asked if he was okay patted him on the shoulder and said, "I told you. Good things for good people." 2 weeks later, he moved to Chicago. The orchestra helped him find an apartment. It was small, but it was his. The first place he had ever lived that was truly his own. On his first day of rehearsal, he walked into the concert hall wearing the same clothes he had worn to the audition. The same coat. The same boots. The same violin case held together with duct tape and rope. Some of the other musicians looked at him strangely. They had heard the story by now. The kid who came out of nowhere. The kid who had shocked everyone. But they still couldn't quite believe it when they saw him in person. He didn't care what they thought. He knew who he was. He knew what he could do. He took his place in the first chair, opened his grandmother's violin case, and lifted the old instrument to his chin. When the conductor raised his baton and the music began, he played like he always did. Like he was back in that little living room in Mississippi. Like his grandmother was sitting right beside him. Like he was talking to God, and everyone listened. Months later, a reporter asked him about his journey. They wanted to know how a kid with no formal training and no connections had made it to the top of one of the country's most prestigious orchestras. He thought about the question for a long time before answering. "People look at the outside and think they know everything about you," he said. "They see your clothes. They see where you come from. They see what you don't have. And they make up their minds before you even open your mouth." He held up his grandmother's violin, the scratched wood, the faded varnish, the tape holding the case together. "But what you carry on the outside isn't what matters. It's what you carry in here." He touched his chest. "That's what nobody can judge until you let it out." He smiled, running his fingers along the strings of the old violin. "I let it out, and now they'll never forget."